Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video I wanted to cover some of the iconic Lone Ranger's other exploits outside of the classic radio series and then the television series. Now the Lone Ranger of course exploded across the radio airwaves and is one of the most iconic not only characters but also series of the golden age of radio. Currently I'm finally listening to the radio series in terms of the surviving episodes in chronological order, so it was fascinating to be able to check out both examples of the Pulp magazines that lasted for a short while, but also one of the novels, because there are a series of novels that were published over at least over a span of time into the 1950s sporadically. So there's actually quite a bit of other Lone Ranger material outside of the radio series before the start of the classic television series. And both iterations in terms of the Pulp magazine and the novels basically feel like expanded versions of what you find in the original radio incarnation in terms of the stories are very well told but simple, and the characters basically feel exactly the same. So these basically feel like expanded episodes of the radio series. So to go over the Pulp magazines first, these lasted for about a year. So there's only a handful of the magazines, and thankfully all have been done by Adventure House in their lovely reprint series. So I've now read two of these and would like to get the others. Each features a beautifully illustrated cover with bold color that very much puts it right in the classic Pulp magazine style. And we have a nice recreation of the original spine as well. A nice introduction page crediting Adventure House, but this otherwise is replicating the entirety of the original magazine issue. The feature, Valley of Shadows, is the Lone Ranger story, which isn't terribly long, so most of the magazine is actually filled with the supplemental and backup stories, but most of them are actually stories of the West or about Western living, not necessarily always actual new prose fiction or other short stories. Each opens with the Lone Ranger speaks, so there's plenty of usage of the iconography of the character, and this is trying to give fans of the radio series something in addition to just waiting for the next episode. We, of course, have beautiful illustrations for the main story, and this is just a really wonderful way to have something physical that's also a bit more expanded than your traditional half-hour radio episode. But the stories in these two magazines are very well done and basically feel like slightly expanded versions of what you got in one of the radio episodes around this time period, just because it's getting to play around with having a longer form to fit a Pulp magazine. But we have pretty much constant, really nicely done small illustrations throughout to highlight the dramatic points of the story. And these are pretty much peppered throughout, so you always get some sort of nice imagery. Some of them are really nice full page spreads. We get a really nice ad for subscribing to the whole magazine, but the actual story only takes up 64 pages, so it's a little bit on the shorter side, but that means you get quite a bit of supplemental other stories. But again, these are mostly nonfiction sections. The main story itself, Valley of Shadows in this issue, is very good. It deals with essentially someone trying to grab land, but also murdering people, and the Lone Ranger and Tonto having to intervene and try to uncover the actual plot and who is actually behind it to essentially do a land grab scheme. But it's well done. Again, very much what you would expect from an episode of the classic radio series, but basically just imagine one of the half-hour episodes slightly expanded and now able to be a 64-page pulp novel. Also, I'd say a little bit more in terms of action and violence is here because it's a pulp novel and they had to appeal to pulp readership. So not necessarily that these are bloodier than the radio episodes, but because you have the text describing more and the illustrations, just the feeling of the action is a little bit more vivid than the classic radio episodes indicated. So it's a really fun read. It's a very quick read because, again, it's a shorter pulp novel, but then you jump immediately into all of the other materials, which are actually recur throughout. So these are essentially recurring articles and cartoons and comics. So we have actually Western humorous comics Then we have a recurring article series entitled Famous Frontier Fights, which is basically talking about famous battles of the frontier. But while it's nice this was a feature and it has some really nice illustrations, if you actually research some of the battles being described, this is a very not historically accurate depiction of some of these. So it's one of those that you kind of have to look at and then actually research what really happened, and then you find that this is a very one-sided accounting of the so-called battle. But then we jump into a nice Western short story. So again, you do have some fictional backup stories, also very beautifully illustrated. Then we have the recurring outdoor trails section talking about experiences in the outdoors and how to go through the outdoors for sport and health, edited by Dick Wood. And I know that's just, it's a name, but that just cracks me up. I can't help it. It's just, I don't know. But even if this isn't necessarily your thing that you're looking to read, these are nice little sections that also themselves have really nice fitting illustrations of the outdoors being discussed. So even these have a nice sort of feel to them, and this is a recurring section as well. Here we have another comic depiction of Western life, followed by the second fiction backup story, which then transitions into an article on training wild horses if you were looking to do that in the near future. Then we have a whole section entitled The Lone Ranger Stamp Page, which is actually talking about current events and also the state of the character and the magazine. And this is also where you start to get more of the advertisements in the margin. So this is where you get to see more of the vintage ads. It's also a reproduction of the magazine contest page, trying to get readers and especially children to write in and participate. And there is at least a focus on also trying to get more people interested in a Western magazine, hence the Chuckwagon Chat section that concludes each issue. And there's even an inclusion of the write-ins, so you get vintage write-ins of various new fans and kids writing in about how much they love the Lone Ranger magazine. Then there's a fun, silly cartoon on the final page, and then the rear is in the standard Adventure House reprint style. Then I also have the reprint of the November issue, featuring a beautiful pulp cover with really bold color usage, and also a nice recreation of the original spine. Again, this reprints the entire magazine and gives us the lead story in Death's Head Vengeance, a complete Lone Ranger novel. I can't resist doing beautiful titles like that in trailer voice, so I apologize. I can't help it. But again, we have really beautiful artwork scattered throughout, and this basically reads like an expanded version of one of the radio episodes. In particular, this one actually I think is drawn, at least partially, on one of the radio episodes I've heard, featuring two men working a mine and one basically who is, shall we say, not the nicest of characters, just basically decides to kill his partner and make off with the entirety of the gold that they had mined, or actually his partner had mined while he sat around complaining. But there is beautiful artwork scattered throughout, really nicely done, and of course reprinting the original pages with the dual column text. But this one is even shorter at only 44 pages. So the story very much feels, in this instance, it actually does feel like a slightly expanded version of one of the radio episodes I've heard, but it's even shorter than the other volume. And then that means you have more of the supplemental content. So this has a fun vintage quiz with the answers in the back. You have another cute vintage Western comic. We have the first of the prose stories that's contained as a backup feature. Then we have another of the rather historically inaccurate renditions of a famous frontier fight in text form. It's nicely written enough, but it is very much an artifact of its time in terms of how it's depicting the actual events. So again, if you read this, I would recommend actually looking up the actual conflict or battle online or somewhere first and then reading what actually happened. Interestingly, we also have a plug, but also really more of a complete summary of Mystery of the Hooded Horseman, which is a Tex Ritter film vehicle. So this is basically giving you a complete summary with photographs and stills of a actual Western film. So that's kind of interesting that they basically give you not only an ad for the film, but they basically give you the full summary of it. And then we also have scattered throughout our more essentially humorous newspaper-style cartoon images. There are more elements of Western living and Western iconography scattered throughout with images. So this is more varied than the first issue because there's simply more pages to fill. Here is an article about the disappearing of buffalo due to overhunting, which is nice to see even at this time, it actually being discussed. We have another lovely prose story. Dick Wood returns for more outdoor trails. Sorry, I can't help it. I know it's a normal name, but it cracks me up every time. But anyway, this is another of the outdoor living sections. Then we essentially have another real-life cowboy section, this depicting a moment of actual trail driving. And then we have yet another fun comic reproduction. And then the stamp page section with all of the specific magazine materials, and then another contest page with a seek and find. Then another cute comic to close out on. Of course, the rear is in the standard Adventure House style. So they did actually reprint all of the issues, and I'd like to pick up the others. The only thing that I will say about these is because the actual Lone Ranger story is so short in each of these, most of these magazines are actually taken up by all of the supplemental features. So if you were like me coming to these looking for mostly fiction stories or just a bunch of pulp fiction stories with a Western theme, you will be at least slightly disappointed because most of these are actually taken up by all the other stories. But taken as a whole, it's a nice snapshot of people's view of the West in terms of in the 1930s, but also of the popularity of the Lone Ranger. So if you're a fan of the radio series, these are an absolute must because they're basically the radio series in print form. Now, in terms of novels, there's actually a substantial number of them, but unfortunately they're all long out of print. So essentially there are nearly 20 novels ranging from the 1930s all the way up to the early 1950s, all dealing with the character. Most are actually credited or at least had some work done on them by Fran Striker, who is one of the primary figures behind the creation of the character and the writing and development of the radio series. So there's really no one better to write Lone Ranger stories. So at least most of them should have the correct flavor because he wound up working on or writing most of these novels. Unfortunately, they all have not been reprinted since Pinnacle Books did some nice paperbacks in the early 1980s. So you're stuck with tracking those down or the earlier editions mostly done by Grosset and Dunlap, which are themselves not common and very collectible. So hopefully someday someone will reprint all of these. But there is one novel you can read, which is The Lone Ranger Rides, which I have a copy of behind me. This is actually in the public domain, so it's even on Project Gutenberg, so anyone can read this, and I will leave a link in the description. This is written by Fran Striker, and for whatever reason is the one book that is clearly in the public domain. But what's really important about this is it's not exactly a straight-ahead adventure. The Lone Ranger has a basic origin story, but it's not really ever developed or gone into all that much, which in ways kind of helps some of the mysterious qualities of the character. You don't necessarily need to have a complete origin retelling for a character to be iconic. Well, in this book, actually, it basically is the origin story, fully developed, but also tied into a separate story. So it essentially is the origin of the Lone Ranger in novel form that is woven into I guess technically what you'd call the Lone Ranger's first case as the Lone Ranger. So you have the basic ideas of the origin story of an ambush on a bunch of Texas Rangers, and the Lone Ranger is born by the one survivor being nursed back to health by his friend Tonto and taking elements of his dead brother's clothing and using that, of course, course, to make the iconic Lone Ranger's mask. The actual mystery plot that led to the killing of the Texas Rangers in an ambush and what has to be uncovered is essentially nefarious goings-on at a big ranch estate, and someone in the family obviously is up to no good and also trying to essentially mix criminal activities with trying to take over the ranch from the cranky older statesman. So there's quite a bit of story development, actually, and it's not a terribly long book, but it's also interesting in that you're essentially getting the origin story of the Lone Ranger in novel form. The only issue is that that kind of feels a little bit rushed because it's basically sharing the book with another plot. It's woven in perfectly, so it works, and it gives you a slightly expanded version of the basic elements of the origin story we know, and the characters are all spot on because you have the primary creator and writer of the radio series actually getting to sit down and write a full novel. So this is essential for all fans of the character or all fans of Westerns, because you're not only getting a well-told Lone Ranger story by the primary writer and creator of the character, but you're also getting his version of the origin story actually fleshed out a bit because it's being done again in novel form, and you've got the space as opposed to a 30-minute radio episode. So this is absolutely essential reading, and it's fantastic that of these books, this is the one that's in the public domain, so anybody can pick up and read it. And this would be a great introduction to the character of the Lone Ranger if you've never listened to one of the classic radio episodes or seen the series or seen the very misguided 2013 film adaptation, for example. So if you've never experienced the character, this would be a great start. And again, anyone can read it because it's freely available on Project Gutenberg. That also means there's a variety of editions, and I picked up this one with the rather curious cover of birds on a tree. This is by credited as being printed by Jefferson Publication. This was just a paperback that I found in my local comic shop. It's a very simple, obviously small publisher or self-published, and obviously it is indeed print on demand, as you can see there. But if you actually look at this particular printing, while it's a nice small little paperback, the font is very small, and actually what this is just a printed version of the text that's on Project Gutenberg, right down to the same tiny or small, I should say, illustrations for each chapter. So you can see the text and the actual text block is very small. So this is, it kind of just looks like somebody took the version on Project Gutenberg and just, they didn't even really resize it. They just basically printed it and have the same little chapter separations and these sized down images. And so when I actually looked at the version on Project Gutenberg, it's identical. So this is just basically a printed version of the free version you can read. But there are a variety of other printings of this, so you can get at least some version of this in book form in terms of this one novel, because it's free to reprint. But I would just say check out the version on Project Gutenberg first, and then maybe track down a various paperback edition or a vintage edition, because this is the one that basically you can read for free and anybody can reprint. Now, even at this smaller, thin paperback size with the small text, it still is about 120 pages. So, it's a significant book in terms of length. It is lengthy enough to be able to tell a nice Lone Ranger story, but also do a version of the origin story and basically mesh the two together. It is a really good read. In fact, I would compare it in a lot of ways to reading one of the classic Johnston McCulley Zorro stories in terms of getting the Zorro character written by his creator in his original form without having constraints of a shorter runtime or different medium. That's what this book most closely represents, because you have the primary writer of the Lone Ranger getting to basically use a book length to expand upon his own character that he was writing regularly for the radio series. So that would be the sort of feeling I would describe this book of giving you. It is an essential read in terms of classic American pop culture, but also the development of the Western and Western heroes, and also, most of all, for fans of the Lone Ranger. If you haven't read The Lone Ranger Rides, then you really have to, and you can because thankfully it is in the public domain and freely available. So that's just my short little overview of some examples of the Lone Ranger during the classic era of the character during the heyday of the radio series in other forms of media. Again, Adventure House has reprinted all the issues of the Pulp magazine in these nice replicas, so if you'd like to pick those up, you can get them on their website, which I'll link to in the description. But also, I will link to The Lone Ranger Rides, which is free to read on Project Gutenberg and most anywhere where you get public domain ebooks. And it's a really good novel written by the primary writer of the character and also does a really nice version of the origin story. I think this is an essential read, and again, it is absolutely free, so there's no reason to not give it a try. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below to this novel on Project Gutenberg, and also some links to information about the other books, which I really want to read, but unfortunately, they are not in the public domain, and they are only found on increasingly older collectible book editions. Again, the last time they were reprinted was really to tie in with the Legend of the Lone Ranger movie from 1981 that famously did not do very well. So the last printing of the books was in 1980-81, and they've never been reprinted since. So needless to say, those are getting more and more expensive and harder to track down, but hopefully I can find some of those in the near future at a decent price, or even better, maybe somebody might be able to license them and do a really nice, simple, affordable reprint of them, because if they're anywhere near as good as the Lone Ranger Rides, as I'm sure they probably are, they would make for fantastic reading for fans of the character. So, as always, I hope my babblings about classic pulp fiction, classic westerns and western stories, and the magical world of the master writer of the plains himself has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I don't really have too much of a history of the character, but I've always been fascinated by the iconography, and once I started listening to the radio series and the surviving episodes, I quickly became addicted, so I've just been delving into other aspects of the Lone Ranger wherever possible, and these were just too fascinating to resist. So I thought it would be a good idea to cover both the Pulp magazine replicas and the one novel in the public domain in this video. So hopefully I can turn on more people to the classic character, but also Adventures of the Lone Ranger outside the radio and television series. So as always, please keep supporting independent publishers by picking up some lovely reprints of classic pulp era material. Keep supporting your local independent bookstores and comic stores, which hopefully have some lovely pulp era materials for you to dig through. And as always, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching.